All right. Can everybody hear me?
Right.
Yeah, so welcome everybody. I'm so glad we're able to do this. We're finally able to get together after these 2 years. I'll introduce myself. I'm Terri Shieh-Newton. I'm a life sciences patent attorney at Mintz, and I've been working in the synthetic biology field for over 20 years. So I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists, Milana, Trounce from Stanford, Natalie, Kuldell from BioBuilder, and Karyn, Riegel from Leaps by Bear. So I'd like to get into the topic of each of your organizations and what you do for your organization. So my first question for Milana. So you teach a healthcare leadership class at Stanford, which is focused on building diversity amongst other topics. Can you share some of what you teach with our audience, which is particularly relevant for aspiring women leaders and founders?
Sure. So thank you, first of all. It's such a pleasure to be here. There's such a cool vibe to this event. By way of introduction, I'm actually an emergency medicine doc, and I'm honored to be in the company of synthetic biologists and all the people in the field. I come to it from the perspective of also biosecurity, where I teach a class on biosecurity, which in one of the definitions is building resilience to threats posed by infectious organisms, whether natural, like pandemics, or man-made as a result of synthetic biology or what have you. And I've been doing this for the last 13 years. Long stories to how I got into this. And then another class I teach at Stanford also has to do with healthcare leadership. And I thought that actually some of the insights from this class are actually particularly relevant to this panel. And I just want to start with an observation and bringing in some data from our colleagues, who are doing research on leadership in the business schools and other places. And I wanted to say, with all the due respect to the men, that women tend to outperform men on many leadership skills. Again, according to hundreds of studies with thousands, tens of thousands of participants, women do particularly well in teams and which are dependent on innovation. Because again, women are so collaborative, and where women really do bring a lot of these perspectives and allow these perspectives to bubble up. So one of the things that was amazing to me from actually my time at Stanford Business School was a realization that despite the fact that women tend to be so good at leadership, how is it that that we don't see kind of enough of the female founders or CEOs in synthetic biology and, of course, many other fields. And I think besides the obvious structural challenges, maybe such as raising family or whatever, I think there's some things that have to do with biases. And one of the biggest shockers from the business school is that I realized some of these biases can be hacked in synthetic biology terms. So one of the most memorable classes that I took in the business school was actually, and this is something that I continue teaching in my class, the class was actually called Acting with Power. And there was a realization that, initially I thought, difference between men and women is just something you're born with, and, this is just how it is. Turns out, so many of these skills can be learned, and turns out, a lot of it actually has to do more with our behavior than actually even the content, that what we say. One of the things that was amazing to me, it's actually not as much about the content of we say. It matters a lot less than how we say it, and even that matters a lot less than our behavior around it. And most people form impressions of our competence actually before we even start speaking. So if I speak like this and kind of climb into get into a ball, I'll be perceived as less confident than if I occupy more space and speak slowly with pauses. So anyway, I just thought I'd share this little pearl. I know we don't have a lot of time, but both men and women can benefit greatly from kind of this realization, which for me was a blind spot, even kind of after medical school and after all that. And again, there are classes on this. This is something that can be learned.
Often. Well, thank you. Thank you. And I think we will want to explore the notion of implicit bias, I think, later on. So Natalie, let's talk about BioBuilder.
Sure.
So you are the founder and executive director. So can you tell us how did BioBuilder come about, and
Sure.
what does the organization do?
Sure. So thank you. It is lovely to be here, and thank you for having me on this panel. I run BioBuilder Educational Foundation. It is a 10-year-old nonprofit organization. If you had asked me 11 years ago if I would be running a nonprofit organization, I sure would have said no. I never really anticipated that this would be my path. But we believe that there's a different way for people to learn and to talk about biology, and that for whatever reason, when we teach life science, a lot of the times we hide the very best parts of being in science and being a scientist when we teach it. So BioBuilder really started with the idea that we could teach and learn biology differently, that we could engage students as problem solvers and teachers as the lever of change. We have an incredible system through the United States that is foundational to our democracy, actually, and that is the public education system. So one of the food panelists came up earlier today and said, you know, there's an infrastructure for growing button mushrooms. There's also an infrastructure for educating our young innovators, and that is our public school system. And so my goal with BioBuilder really is to introduce the way science is done to young scientists in the classroom with hands-on labs, asking important questions that the professionals in the field are asking, and in that way introduce the best of science and enlighten the way students learn it. Yeah.
Right, thank you, Natalie.
Sure.
All right, so Karyn, so tell us a little bit about Leaps by Bayer, and how did you come into the synthetic biology ecosystem?
No, thanks so much for having me, Terri. And it's humbling to be part of this panel with all of these incredible women and to be at this event. This is my first biotech conference, actually, because I don't come from this world. I come from the world of storytelling. So on some level, first of all, I'll tell you how I got here, and then I'm going to tell you about how we operate at Leaps. In some level, science runs in my veins because I was raised by a bunch of doctors and lawyers, and everybody in my world was either in medicine or engineering, it seemed. But storytelling was my route. And so I come from a background with cinema studies. I come from this idea of storytelling and this notion that we can really open the way people think by the way we share stories. And so I've also run a not-for-profit, although on the film side, and I realized at one point that digital communication was the way that we would really transform the way people see things. So I've done a lot of different things, working from digital experiences, running a trend scouting program, and working for brands like Nike and Audi and whatnot. But I think the most meaningful and exciting work that I've done in my career has been thus far at Leaps by Bayer. So we are the strategic impact investment unit of Bayer, so tasked to invest across both health and agriculture. And it's been such an honor to have access to learn about there's some 50 companies in our portfolio, and a lot of what I do is about helping them to elevate their stories and to bring the topics that inevitably emerge through the bleeding edge of biotechnology. How do we bring that into the public sphere? And so that's, there's so much that's been said at this conference already about the importance of communicating science. And I think there's so much that needs to be said too about not just who we not just how that we communicate to the public, but also who's doing the speaking and how do we bring that to a bigger stage? Because it's, for me, really exciting when we see not just the same old faces, but that there's a much broader audience. I think this is so important for us as individuals, and for us, I think a lot of us on this panel are also mothers. Yes. And so how do we inspire the next generation? That's what's so important and exciting to me about being here with all of you, and broadly about this organization, and especially what Natalie's doing, because I want my daughter to go through her program.
My daughter goes to her program.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Karyn. So with respect to communication, and circling back to Milana's point about implicit bias, what have you guys learned in your individual experiences about the communication and the implicit bias that either as an audience member, looking at somebody and just making that impression for the first time, versus a presenter, or if you're a founder and you're pitching a company, or maybe from the investment side, right? When somebody's pitching a company or trying to grow their company or tell their story, what sort of experiences have you seen that you can share with the audience that maybe they can take that as a practical tip of how to communicate, how to storytell, how to convey themselves in a way that has maximal impact?
Would you like
Anybody? Yeah.
Well, actually, so that's one of the things that I've alluded to. Do you guys know that, for example, Margaret Thatcher, she took voice classes. Mostly, she actually studied chemistry at Oxford too, by the way. She could have been a synthetic biologist, if she were living now. But yeah, so this is something that, when I mentioned something like this can be hacked, there is actually a certain set of very specific behaviors, and I would recommend actually, classes. There are a lot of online resources, including those by Deborah Grunfeld. Frankly, even awareness of them, I think for me that was eye-opening. For me, that was one of the biggest aha moments in the business school. And again, these kinds of things can be practiced and taught, and there are entire classes that are based on this. And I think this is applicable to both presenters, and also this is applicable to investors. Again, this is a skill like any other. It's a part of the presentation skill, but it's kind of a version of that. It's going beyond of how do you give an effective presentation. It's awareness of power dynamics and how that's manifested through behavior. And I think that goes beyond kind of quote unquote good presentation skills, because I think in some situations, actually, you might want to be more accessible. For example, some men, they tend to act kind of very high, and that actually can get them in trouble. Like, I've seen that with some of my ER residents, on one hand. And then there's some women who tend to act kind of lower, and that can also get them in trouble. So finding kind of your authentic range that's yours, you don't want to be, I think, acting like somebody you're not, but finding that authentic range that's still yours and expressing that part of yourself that you want to present at that moment, I think can go a really long way.
Natalie, what about you?
Well, I guess I will admit that I don't think at the top of my head a lot about the things that I'm facing in this way. I maybe just a little oblivious to it, maybe just not enough aware of it, but I was trying to think about what I might say on this panel today. I was talking with my daughter, and she said, maybe you just need a teaspoon of Muhammad Ali in your talk. I thought, well, that's an interesting way to put it. So maybe just a teaspoon of Muhammad Ali as we talk to people, a little bit of pride, a little bit of just self-referential ability to say what you do without pulling your punches, by that same analogy, and that may just be part of what gets your message across in different audiences, I think.
So Karyn, from the standpoint of communicating your story, is there a different approach that founders of companies who are women versus men, does it make a difference, or does it not really? It's more about the personality and how one portrays, how one communicates, how one is received by some of the body language that Milana was talking about.
This is the thing, it's always so hard to generalize, right? Because when all of us were talking before, I think the fact that we have the confidence to be on this stage is a testament to the fact that we're not afraid, and that we're more, that we bring a certain confidence. And every person is different. There are men, there are women, there are people from all kinds of backgrounds who have different levels of comfort being in front of an audience. So I think it's hard to say there's something that's specific for women versus men, but I think this idea that this idea of bias that Milana brought up is so important. And I think it's something we all need to come with consciously, that no matter how enlightened we think we are, we all carry implicit bias in some way, shape, or form. And this definitely goes beyond male and female. We're talking about a whole range of how diversity plays out these days. And it's I know this is a controversial topic, it's political, but there's so much research, and a lot of research that should make us kind of uncomfortable. And the more we can confront the way that we look at men and women, and how we, men, women, different people of color, how we react to people, and the more that we understand how that's operating, like women are 3 times more likely to be seen as aggressive and significantly less likely to be seen as brilliant. And so, there's biological studies about how white people react to some people of color. There's a heart rate change that kind of goes into flight mode. So if you can recognize those things and realize that might be happening, and then you can start to work to subvert that. And there's a lot of great tools out there, I think, are a really important way to how to learn to present oneself. It is a bit like learning to walk out on a stage.
Maybe I can also add one more comment. I love research data, especially the research that has to do with organizational behavior. And one thing, I was just reading an article recently as I was kind of preparing for this panel. There was a study that involved over 5,000 participants, which compared the rating of perception of self-competence versus perception of how others perceive your competence. And there was a significant difference in gender. And what was interesting is that there was the biggest difference in gender in the perception of confidence, particularly before the age of 25, where women were far more likely to rate themselves as much less competent compared to, and men tended to rate themselves as overcompetent. And that's against how actually their managers or how their leaders perceive their competence. So it was kind of more of again, this has to do with perception, but it was more of an objective measure. Then by the age of around 40, they're about equal, kind of similar. And then actually after age 60, the men's confidence perception drops a little and the women's continues rising. And overall, there was about an 8% increase in the perception of self-competence for men, kind of from the time they're 18 to kind of, the very end of their career. And for women, that's a whopping about 30% leap. So kind of think about how differently it is that they start. Yes. And that, of course, drives how, whether women perceive promotions or start companies or, doing those kinds of things. So I feel like even awareness of that data is just important. First step is understanding in my mind before kind of making changes. So anyway.
And in our preparation for this panel, we had talked about the question of gender gap in synthetic biology. We've talked about this in past synthetic biology meetings where there's a question of why aren't there more women in synthetic biology? So do any of the panelists have any comments about how we can address the gender gap in synthetic biology? Is it starting from the beginning, right?
Sure.
With BioBuilder? Yeah. Is it about educating ourselves about perception and some implicit bias?
Yeah.
A combination of a lot of these factors. So let's talk about BioBuilder. And
Sure. So it is interesting that I see a lot of women, young women, attracted to BioBuilder. And I think some of that is that we front run purpose, that is the building of biology to meet a real world challenge. And there are a lot of young women who say, sign me up. I see something that I want to do, and I believe I can do it. So at least at the high school age where we are working, there is a majority of our students who are women. And I think it is that we can ask them to apply biology to do something good in the world. And then they will learn the science, they will learn the math, they will learn the engineering that it takes to do that. If what we do instead is put gatekeeping classes in front of entry into this wonderful opportunity of building with biology, then I think we will turn away women. One of my colleagues says that it shouldn't be called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. It should be called METS, because without math, you really can't get into the rest of those disciplines. And I think a lot of young women get turned off from math very early. So from my perspective and from my world, I would say that front-running the purpose and making sure that math and math skills are taught in a way that is inclusive would make a really big difference in seeing the pipeline of women far wider for this field.
And we also talked about role models.
Oh, yeah.
Having role models, I think all of us have mentioned. I know I send my daughter to Natalie's program like right away because I think she's a great model and others, but I feel like that is so important. I grew up, you know, I know it's not synthetic biology, but medicine. I grew up actually in Ukraine, believe it or not, but there, it was still USSR. You know, all of my grandmothers were doctors, you know, all of my grandfathers were doctors. You know, most women in Russia were doctors, and here, when I came, you're like, oh, like, it's amazing, you're a woman and you're a doctor. I was like, what? So that made no sense. And I think it's just seeing people
Yes.
around you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that definitely plays an important role, and I can only echo that from, you know, teaching. I did a session at my daughter's 6th grade class on STEM, and I showed them this video we made with the New York Times about Nia, who's the CEO of Fork and Good. All the girls came up to me afterwards, and they said, I could start a biotech company. It was really cute.
Yes.
And so watch, like, the world, their ideas are totally different when they see role models on stage who they can relate to.
Absolutely.
But I think there's also, you know, it's not just about role models. That's an important part of it. There is this recognition of bias. There's also, you know, the organizational dimension of how do we actually create more inclusive environments? How do we bring more women up to the top? Because something like, you know, I think it's a generous number of 10% of women in biotech, or, you know, women occupy something like 10% of C-suite leadership positions. And if it's those same, you know, 10% of women who keep getting asked to be on different boards and taking different roles, we're not going to get anywhere. So I'm really excited about accelerator programs and a lot of initiatives that I know people in this room are leading, because we need to bring more women up to the surface.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe talk a little bit about the accelerator program for those who, yeah, no, okay, yeah, okay. So I mean, all of you've been in your respective industries a long time. So what have you learned along the way that you can pass on as practical advice for those who want to start their own organization or who want to create a new program like biosecurity, or, you know, want to help people communicate their stories?
Well, I mean, I will say there is one thing that I have learned and one thing that I try to remember. So the thing that I have learned along the way is that it is okay to trust your gut. That if something is telling you that the situation isn't what you are expecting it to be, or it's not going to work, it's okay to say, I can't tell you why, but this is just not something that as an organization we want to do, or it's not where we're going to go. So trusting your gut, I think, is something that I have learned along the way as an okay and a good thing to do. And that's something I try to keep in mind is this phrase, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. Because I do think that collaboration and working with people who are aligned is the way to really make the biggest difference.
I mean, for me, it comes down to a question of not only how do we do this, but how do we make ourselves accountable for this? Because the other, you know, the question of, you know, are quotas the way to get there? Part of me thinks yes. I think really setting measurable goals and really holding ourselves accountable to what we aim to achieve is really important. It's something that I think Bayer has been doing on a global level, which is really, really important. And it's really hard to do with a global organization of 100,000 people operating outside, a lot of it out of the US. So this is really important work to be done. And I think it's something we all have to look at as, you know, putting as a priority for ourselves, because everybody in this room, we're here writing the future. And if that future isn't inclusive, if that future doesn't have everybody at the table, you know, the diversity, as everyone who guys come from biology, diversity is the main survival strategy of most species on Earth. And if we don't program that into the way that we're operating as businesses, as scientists, as leaders, we're going to need to find some other survival skills.
Well, so I see that we are at the end of our time, and I wanted to thank our panelists, Milana and Natalie and Karyn, very much for your helpful insight and sharing your stories. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That was so kind of you. So nice.
Thank Thank you so much. We're going to shift gears a little bit.